Welcome to the Third Decade Podcast, where we believe every young adult deserves the confidence to take control of their financial future. Whether you're just getting started or you're well on your way towards financial independence, we're here to give you the tools and guidance you need to build a life that aligns with your dreams. Let's turn financial uncertainty into opportunity together.
Hi, Third Decade community. I'm your host, Nikita Wolf, and today I'm joined by Third Decade CEO as my co-host, Joe'Mar Hooper.
Hello, everybody.
We're going to be covering family financial planning and all of the different things to take into consideration if you are either in the trenches already and you have a family established and they're 10 years old or 20 years old, as well as those that are maybe just thinking about starting a family.
So this is a timely topic for us. We hear a lot of third decaders talk about families. Mm-hmm. They're at that age where they're starting to think about planning a family or starting a family. Some of them already have families. I know I started my family in my early 20s, mm-hmm. and I didn't know a darn thing. Like, seriously. I barely know much now, but I knew even less in my early 20s. So it was kind of like the wilderness for me when it came to figuring out how to navigate finances for my family. So I'm happy that we have a platform today to be able to talk a little bit about what that looks like. Yes. And I mentioned that this is timely. We're at a really interesting point right now for young adults. You know, we're seeing inflation go up significantly. The housing costs have significantly increased. There's some stats that I saw that really interest me. So the U.S. Median home price is $426,000, which is double the median price at the beginning of the decade. So we know families, you're maybe outgrowing your first apartment, want to buy a house. That's a consideration. And then inflation. Inflation has been significant over the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. Cost of goods and services are up 20% since the pandemic, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So a lot of considerations that we need to think about when it comes to folks thinking about having a family, already having a family, and how they navigate life at this point.
Absolutely. And I think as well, a lot of people think that you just kind of have to go into it and wing it.
Yeah.
And while there's some amount of winging it that you have to do along the way, there are certainly some things you can do to make it easier on yourself.
Yeah.
If you can plan for them ahead of time and kind of know what to expect. So.
I'm glad you mentioned winging it, because I'm going to tell my personal story. I winged it for most of my life, and somehow it worked out. I was able to fall upstairs, but it doesn't work that way for everybody. And that's why we want you all to have a plan for your families and start to think about things. But I can't tell you the amount of stress that caused upon me and my family not having those plans. You see, I'm bald. I don't know if I would have hair if I would have had a plan for my family at some point in time. But no, I really tried to navigate things as they came. I had a little bit of knowledge. I got not that much guidance going on. Mm-hmm. So how can our goal today is really to impart some knowledge, some things that you want to start thinking about as you're headed into family planning, as you're headed into raising your kids, and thinking about the long game when it comes to college and beyond as well, too. Mm-hmm. So as we're talking about planning for families and children and things, I think you kind of have a really interesting experience that you're dealing with right now when it comes to that.
Yes. So I'm very type A, always have been. I really thought I was ahead of the game because about a year before I wanted to start trying for a family, I was already thinking about what that first year of life would cost, first 2 years of life really, and set up a plan for saving towards that. I think life has a funny way of showing you that even with the best plans, there is compromise, or there is, flexibility within that, and you have to adapt. Because we had planned for one child, and then as soon as I saw that second heartbeat on the screen, I was like, well, that savings account is underfunded. We're going to have to figure that out. So, and that's just to say, I think to myself all the time about how much worse that would have felt if I hadn't planned anything. And now I'm getting hit with a double expense in a lot of areas. So, at least I had some of those costs already accounted for and covered, but life is unpredictable. And it's really crucial if you're able to plan ahead of time, just to give yourself that ease into, starting a family and raising a family.
To be a fly in the room when you found out that you were having twins, I could imagine the surprise. So you mentioned 2 heartbeats. There was probably 3 heartbeats as yours was beating out of your chest.
Yeah, well, especially whenever my OB was basically like, well, I'm just double checking that there's not a third. I was like, there's not be a third. I can't do a third. My house is not big enough for that. So, my husband and I think just literally laughed for like a week. Thankfully, we were both very open to that experience anyways, and we were genuinely excited. I know that would cause dread at first for some people. We were pretty stoked about it right off the bat, but it just felt so comical that we just, I think for the first week, looked at each other and would just start chuckling. So yep, that's what that experience was like if you had been a fly on the wall.
Well, you had a plan, and for one, now you have a plan for two.
Yes.
Now, when we talk about plans, goal setting is probably one of the most important things that we want to really impart as we start this journey and talking about family and financial planning. So goals are super important. So one of the things, I mentioned that I have had limited guidance and limited thoughts, but I have practiced goal setting as a part of my family for a long time. Me and my wife actually instituted this new thing called a strategic plan for ourselves. We saw it on Instagram. Right?
It's very executive of you.
It is. And we actually, so how we do it is kind of cool. Every year, we have a strategic planning meeting where we actually go somewhere. We're going to have a good meal. We're going to have a good conversation. So our heads are clear, and we're really going to act just like, you've been through strategic planning with me at Third Decade. So we're actually going to have a family meeting every year that we outline our goals for the year, our short-term goals, our long-term goals for the year. What vacations we want to take, how we're going to pay for college, how we're going to encourage our daughters to hurry up and graduate so we don't have to pay for that too much longer. Just, are we getting, our cars need fixing this year, upgrading? So there's a ton of things that we think about in that strategic planning meeting when it comes to setting goals for our family. So maybe let's tackle that. Let's start and talk about some considerations folks should think about when setting up their long and short-term goals.
Yeah. So short-term goals, some of this I'm going to speak to personally just because I am like actively walking through it as we speak. But I think the first thing that comes to mind and that came to my mind when I realized that how much my life was about to change was what our emergency fund was going to look like and how that looks different once you add 2 more humans into your space. If you're aiming for that 3 to 6 months of expenses, now your monthly expenses have maybe increased by a few hundred or a couple $1,000s, depending on the situation. So you want to adjust that number and start saving towards that new emergency fund goal. As well as, like you said, do you want vacations to be part of your short-term, every year? Do you want to still do something small? Do they look a little bit different? Childcare costs, definitely, if you're dealing with littles. Absolutely. Or if you're doing any sort of private school, if you have middle-aged children. The first year expenses, I think everybody warns you about how expensive babies are. I'm sure that they are, but I also, part of me is skeptical, and we'll see if if this ages poorly for me. But I do think that a lot of the times people, buying into what you see on social media and needing the nicest things and the newest things, those things add up. You can certainly have variability in the first year expenses, but you might want to ask for yourself, what do you want that to look like? If you do want to have all new baby clothes, maybe that's what you're going to do, and it is going to be a little bit more expensive, and you can plan for that. But you can also buy things on consignment or thrift them and things like that and save 80% towards the clothes just right there. So those are maybe some short-term goals that I would consider. As far as long-term goals go, we're talking retirement. How does this impact our retirement savings? Can we still keep our investment threshold at a similar amount, maybe even a higher amount if you can? Do we need to maybe take a small break while they're really little and we're incurring daycare costs, just to kind of know what to expect? And that's why it's so helpful to be aware of your numbers and running your numbers ahead of time before you enter into that, as well as other long-term goals like buying a home. Yep. I also want to caution here, just because you have a kid or 2, maybe 3, more if you're really bold. I'm impressed. Your home doesn't necessarily need to be upgraded. It, of course, is always nice to have a lot of extra space, but if that's going to derail all of your other financial plans, there are compromises that can be made, and you don't necessarily have to, it's easy to fall into the trap of keeping up with the Joneses and
especially in this market.
Yes, 100%. So you do want to think about your long-term goals of buying a home, or if maybe you don't have a home yet and you're not looking to upgrade, but just to have a home of your own. That's part of the planning you might want to do, as well as funding your children's education, or maybe just their future. We'll talk a little bit later in this episode about different ways to do that. But oftentimes people want to plan for their children's entry into adulthood as well. So those would be some long-term goals that you look at. And same as with when we build out our own personal budgets, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong in what line items are important to you to keep as part of your family's expenses. But it's going to be the same thing with a family. You want to look at your values and your priorities and have a strategic planning meeting with your partner and figure out, what is important to us? How do we want to allocate our funds every year? And allow those values to kind of direct how your money is spent.
It's all about priorities. That's the big takeaway here. You want to make sure that your strategic plan for yourself and your goals for yourself includes those things you prioritize. There's going to be a lot of fluctuations throughout the year, and you're going to have to deal with them, but figure out your priorities and figure out how to move forward with them in a specific document. So, and when we talk about priorities, budgeting, I come from a government background. We always say government budgeting is showing your priorities as a community. Mm-hmm. It's also kind of that way for your family too. You want to be able to ensure that you have a strong budget that shows what you prioritize when it comes to expenses and how the money coming in is going to be spent for the year. So let's talk about some budget considerations that folks need to understand as well.
Yeah, and again, I'll say that this is really a lot easier if you're doing it ahead of time of starting a family. But of course, we got to meet ourselves where we're at if we are in it and we are just needing to learn as we go. But first and foremost, you want to know how much income you have and, from what sources. Do you both work? Do you have a rental property that maybe generates some income or some other passive income stream, as well as tracking your expenses? I think not just guesstimating your expenses. It's very easy to say, I think that I spend, about $500 a month on groceries. But if you're reliably spending more like $800 a month on groceries, that hole in the boat is eventually going to present itself, and you're going to feel that eventually because it's just a slow bleed, and you'll see your savings deplete. But yeah, just to track your expenses and adjust certain expenses. If you're especially entering into starting a family, you're going to want to reassess how much your health insurance is going to cost, because the plan for 2 adults is different than a plan for 2 adults and children. So you'll want to account for that whenever you're building out a new budget. Any medical care, so especially, birth is an expensive one. You want to be aware of what your health insurance is going to cover in that and what it won't cover, kind of what your out-of-pocket max would be in worst case scenarios. Your food is going to change in cost, perhaps not because of the baby in the first year, but maybe if you're breastfeeding, like you are hungry and you need to be consuming more calories than typical, and you might need to adjust for that. And then especially when kids do start eating, then, you're really going to need to adjust your food budget for that.
Absolutely.
Life insurance, like we talked about in our previous episode, that's going to be a premium that you might want to add once you go into having a family. And daycare is the big one. If you don't have family that is able to help you in town and save you that cost, daycare is significant. I will share for myself, I've called around to about 3 or 4 places so far and gotten quotes that the cheapest I've found was $2,100 a month for 2 babies. And the most expensive was about $2,600 a month. So that is a lot of money, and something that most people are not going to need to worry about 2 at a time, but even half of that is still a really significant financial burden. So something to be aware of and try to plan for, or get creative about. If you have maybe a flexible schedule and you and your spouse can start working 4/10s and, try to cut costs in that way, something like that. So just to make that part of, the expenses that you're planning for.
Yes, and you mentioned when it comes to tracking expenses, and you actually have to track them. So that's a big part of the budget, is making sure you're tracking them. Just a quick story, looking at our budget over the last couple months, we didn't realize that we were spending way more than we had budgeted for groceries. Like, we were going to the grocery store, and we knew that we were going to spend more due to inflation and things, and we had budgeted for that. But we looked at our actual expenses and we're like, I can't believe we're paying this much money for groceries. We really have to kind of dial that back as we move forward into a next month. So tracking and understanding where your money's going after you have your budget, being able to look at that, it's vitally important because we were not necessarily flushing money down the drain, but we looked at our budget and like, okay, we need to readjust some things. So that's important.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because that's a big thing is we are always needing to adjust, what we're expecting based on like the reality. So we have what we think is going to happen, and then we can see what reality, how reality stacks up to that, and then adjust if needed. I've experienced something very similar to you where I think groceries are like the worst item because you're like,
seriously,
this doesn't even feel that exciting. The food's gone in a week. But it's just, it's really expensive, and it's an easy way for funds to just like go missing. You're like, I don't understand where all that money went. So,
have you heard that Mike Tyson quote about a plan?
No.
So Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So us looking at the grocery bill was a punch in the face, and now we have to go back and redo our plan and figure out how we're doing. I did hear a funny method the other day. Folks were talking about maybe you should just take cash to the grocery store so that you have your budget in hand and you can be able to spend based upon that. So that's just one thought that I heard that it piqued my interest the other day.
I like that. The envelope method I think works pretty well for people.
Yeah.
So, I think that would probably work for me too. I might grab a fewer snacks at Trader Joe's if I had to pay for them in cash.
Or less, maybe we don't need organic this week.
Right.
So talk about creating a budget. What are some of the methods and thoughts around how do you actually create a budget?
I know a lot of people, a good place to start is just that 50-30-20 breakdown. So looking at 50% going towards your needs, like a mortgage, your health insurance, the things that are non-negotiables that would make it into your calculations when establishing an emergency fund. 30% being your wants. So if you like to get, a massage or your nails done, or, maybe you just have a skincare line that you're aware is a little bit bougie, but you're like, you know what, I want to plan for it, and so you want to do that. It's those are the discretionary expenses, and then 20% towards savings. So some of that would be retirement, preferably 10 to 15% of that, and some of that might be more like the short-term goals, like are we saving for a project on the house or a family vacation, that kind of thing. So those are really rough breakdowns. You'll have to see exactly where that lands for you, but that's a good place to start. And we can share in the resources on this episode as well, like a budgeting template to help you establish the categories. If you've been through our program, you probably already have one. There are lots of different things that we don't necessarily think of when we're like, what are life expenses that I incur?
Yeah.
But they're there, and lots of different things that can make it into a budget.
Yeah, and one of the considerations in a budget is obviously your revenue that you have coming in each month. And I saw the funniest video. I don't know if it was funny or sad on Instagram the other day. It was talking about Venmo families. So there's some families where they don't mix their income, right? Where there's like they go out to dinner and okay, you pay today, I'll Venmo you my half, or I'll pay this time and you Venmo me 25%. And they're doing that with all their lives, their bills, their whatever. So when me and my wife were first married, we decided that we were going to combine our incomes into one. So we went and got a joint account, and everything comes out. Most things come out of that joint account. So we see that a lot of families don't do that. What are some thoughts that you have about considerations when it comes to mixing with the family? It worked for us. It may not work for everybody else. Venmo would not work for me, but it works for some other people apparently. So
yeah, it may not work for everybody else, but if you are somebody who it's really important to you to have separate finances, I'll start there. Yeah. I would say that if you're thinking about starting a family, maybe the best way to approach those new expenses would be to have an account that is specifically dedicated towards the expenses of the child. So basically like a joint baby account that you guys equally or equitably contribute to. And what we mean by that is if somebody's making $100,000 a year and somebody's making $60,000 a year, we're not going to both be contributing, $300 a month towards that account. We'd be looking at that more proportionately to income. That's what I mean by an equitable contribution. So that would be one way to still keep your finances separate if you wanted to. We've got another really good podcast episode on financial transitions with marriage and whether or not you combine your expenses and your bank account specifically. Speaking personally, my husband and I have actually tried, I think, like 3 or 4 different variations because we were trying to see, what worked for us. We got married when we were younger, and so we had literally nothing coming into the marriage. It didn't feel lopsided or scary to combine at the time. But then it was like, well, I, would love to feel like I can spend my money guilt-free and that it's not impacting you at all. So then we tried some different methods for that. So, really, I think that whenever we're talking about starting a family and having a baby, I do lean towards saying it's probably just going to be simplest to combine at that point. If you are with somebody and you are like that deep into it, you're probably going to want to combine and not be, nickel and diming one another for expenses. Your lives are very much combined at that point.
Just to add, that really helped us when we did combine. We did a thing called the budget committee. So whenever we had a major expense that either one of us had or that we had as a family, we do a quick little huddle and just say, okay, let's call a meeting of the budget committee. Obviously, apparently we're really regimented, apparently, when it comes to strategic planning meetings and budget committees, or just my nonprofit background. But we used to do that, and it really allowed us to, come together and make quick decisions about major purchases that we needed to make. So,
yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. There's one more thing that I also want to touch on is if you have one partner is like a primary caregiver, I think it's really important to view them as financially valuable to the family. I've heard, unfortunately, some really mean stories or just disheartening stories about spouses who end up having a lot of financial control because they're, the breadwinner, but it has to be looked at fairly because without that primary caregiver's time and energy and resources that they're pouring into the family, that family would otherwise be incurring, a $2,000 a month cost potentially, depending on the number of children. And so just to be sure that you're viewing their contribution to the family as having a financial value to it as well, especially whenever you're considering saving for retirement or splitting costs fairly and things like that. So.
And I do want to make one caveat that this is we're assuming that these are healthy conversations you all are having. We do know that there's instances of financial abuse that occur within families when it comes to combining expenses and combining revenues. But, we're assuming, making a lot of assumptions here, that this is for families that are able to communicate and have a good path forward. So we just want to make sure that that's thrown out there as well. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. So let's transition a little bit to talk about debt because, we have our budget, we have our strategic goals. Now we need to figure out how to tackle some of that debt that we have going on here. So I have a couple statistics that I want to talk about when it comes to debt that we're facing, specifically third decaders and folks in that range are facing today. So in Q2 of 2024, the total credit card debt in the U.S. was $1.14 trillion with a T dollars. And the average balance per card holder is about $6,501 on average. The average interest rate for credit cards has increased from 16% at the beginning of 2020 to 22.63% in 24. So that's just credit cards, people. So we're talking. Everyone also has. We're seeing struggles with student loans, high mortgage interest rates, and other forms of debt that people are dealing with as well too. And here's some really stark stats around cars, which keep people in a lot of debt that we need to talk about as well too. As of September of this year, the average monthly payment for a used car is $525 for a used car. And the average monthly payment for a new car is $734. So that's a lot of money. So let's talk a little bit about some ways we can be really mindful about managing the debts that we're taking on and how we manage the debt we already have.
Yeah, I mean, this is a deep topic on this one. So
Very.
The first one is obviously prevention. Some of these things are preventable, like, going out and financing a new car, especially in the context of family financial planning. I know my first thought, because I have been stuck on the Honda train for forever, is should I get a different car? Because right now I'm driving a 2004. but it's reliable. So it's very easy to fall into the like, what feels like luxurious and nice and like, well, we're having a kid, so like we should probably level up in life. That can be a really significant expense. And especially when we're talking about already inviting so many other expenses into your life, that $700 and something a month could make the rest of life feel really unaffordable.
Absolutely.
Especially if your other car was already paid off. Credit card debt is something that I know for a lot of people, it's because of the unfortunate state of our economy and everything costing tons while wages still remain very stagnant. I understand that that is not a reality that everybody has the luxury of not living with, but where you can, making sure that you're buying needs and not buying tons of wants to help prevent some of that credit card debt accumulation. Student loans, you want to make sure of what your obligations are going to be for that. I know we've had a lot of forbearance for a long time now. We don't know when that's going to pick back up, but being aware that it could. So keeping that in mind, and mortgage, kind of like we touched on a little bit ago. If you are already in a house that you can afford and it's capable of serving your family in the next season of your life, staying there. Whereas if you went and bought a new house that was better than your current one right now and had a higher interest rate, you might find yourself really financially stretched thin.
Yes.
Some debt repayment strategies. If you've been through our program, you might remember this. The two primary ones that we cover are the snowball method and the avalanche method. So if we're talking about planning for a family, we might want to just try to do away with as much debt, especially the debt that is, above, let's say 6%, but especially the debt that's above like 10%. You want to pay that off ahead of time. So some ways of doing that. The snowball method is where you are trying to get some momentum by basically giving yourself the dopamine of paying off those small debts first and just working your way up. So if you've got a card with $300 on it, chipping away at that until it's gone, and then working on the next one, maybe it's got $900 on it until that one's gone. So you get that reward early on. It works with a lot of people's brains. It tends to be really successful. With the avalanche method, you're looking more from a mathematical point of view. So if you're able to not feel as much of an emotional baggage around money, the avalanche method can be really cool because you're looking at it strictly from a mathematical perspective of what interest rates are the highest, and the cards with the highest interest rates, even if they might also have the highest balances, those are the ones you're tackling first, because at the end of the day, if you're able to follow through on that entire plan and pay off all of your debts, that's going to be the one that financially benefits you the greatest. So basically starting with the highest interest rate and working your way down, that would be the avalanche method.
Yep. Now, there's some ways to avoid debt as well, too. So let's talk a little bit about those. The thing I love, the concept we teach at Third Decade, is about the hedonic treadmill. So let's talk a little bit about what that is and how that relates to people's mindset around paying off debt.
Yeah, the hedonic treadmill is really interesting and something that I've learned through my time in the classes and being part of the classes is the human capacity to adapt and just feel like you're back at just like a baseline. So the hedonic treadmill is really that cycle of getting the new thing, having like riding that high for a little bit and then acclimating. And then you're like kind of like looking at what somebody else has and going, oh, that sounds kind of nice. I'd like something different. And feeling that draw once again and getting the next new thing. It's the same reason of, you'll see people who are really, really wealthy with maybe, a $2 million house. Now they're selling it to get the $4 million house.
Yes.
And it's like our baseline as humans is concerningly flexible. So just being mindful of that and remembering that, especially when we're talking about a purchase that's going to be something you're financing for the next 5, 10, 30 years, like you don't want to be making huge financial purchases whenever you're just going to acclimate and reach that same level of happiness at the end of the day anyways.
Absolutely. Do not go into debt for your wants. I think we there's a quote, and I'm mistaken who said the quote right now, that we use money we don't have to buy things we don't need to impress people we don't even like.
Yes.
I love that quote. And it happens every day. I've been guilty of it. We all have at some point in time. So, think about those needs versus wants is super important as well. So
yeah, definitely.
So one aspect I want to transition to, you mentioned earlier about funding an emergency fund as a part of your budget and other aspects of your life. I can confess that's not an area that I was strong in for most of my life. I didn't really understand what an emergency fund was and how to really get started in funding it. And I was behind the eight ball a lot of times because I didn't have an emergency fund to back me up when I needed it. I totally understand the value now, and it's something that I've been practicing for a while now, and it's really helped me. And I teach my daughters about having the importance of having that as well too. So can you touch upon like why we should have an emergency fund, and how to really go about ensuring that it's adequate for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there is a stat that we touch on in class that I think it's 32% of Americans can't afford a $400 expense paid off at even the next credit card statement. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty staggering number, and I can't even tell you how many times I've had an unexpected $400 expense, unfortunately.
Too many times.
With the house that I lucked out with getting. So, I mean, just having an emergency fund allows you to avoid going into credit card debt whenever, a few $100 expenses or in some cases a few $1,000 expenses crop up. When you're determining, how much to do, like I mentioned earlier, typically it's 3 to 6 months. So the reason that range exists is if your partner, if you're in a partnership in the first place, wants or has, sorry, I'm going to back up. If your partner has a stable job and you have a stable job, it's very unlikely that you're both going to lose that job in the same, few month period. So you might be able to get away with the lower end of that. Maybe you're only looking at a 3-month emergency fund, because if one of you loses it, it's not like you can't afford any of your expenses. You'll be able to cushion that quite a bit with the other person's income. However, if you're in a household, if we're talking family financial planning, if you're in a household where there's one earner, the other one stays at home with the kids, and that earner loses their job, you're in quite a bit more of a stressful situation. Mm-hmm. So you're probably aiming for 6 months. I've even heard some people who are really, risk adverse doing like a year. That's a lot of money. So I can't even say I personally have reached that goal, but you're wanting to make sure that you can fund 3 to 6 months, depending on your situation, of your essential expenses that have now increased if we're talking about adding family members to it.
Yeah, and I think a big key here is that it sounds daunting, right? 3 to 6 months of money that I have to save into the bank.
Yeah.
If you chunk it out and start thinking about, okay, let's just get $100 in there to start. Mm-hmm. Let's get $250 in there. Let's just keep growing that amount that's in there. That's how you're going to do it. So it's not about rushing out and putting $5,000 in the bank. It's about making sure you grow that emergency fund over time, because you have to start somewhere, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And some really effective ways that I've even been able to do this for myself, because I do track my expenses. I tend to know how much income we made in a month and how many expenses we incurred that month. And if I find that I incurred fewer expenses than I was planning, because that does happen sometimes, it's a nice month when it does, mm-hmm. maybe I can actually shovel away, $300 that month towards that emergency fund rather than the $100 that I had planned. So that's one way of doing it, is just seeing, were my expenses less than I had planned this month, and can I use that to my advantage and kind of move those funds over, because that won't feel like a financial impact to me right now. There are also really cool apps, all sorts of them. I know one of them offhand is named Acorns. Yes. It will round up your purchases and put, like, basically if you're shopping at Target and you pay $59.30, it's going to throw 70 cents into a savings account. Mm-hmm. That might sound very little, but at the end of the day, if you're making lots of charges, that adds up after a while. And that's an easy, kind of more discreet way to also be saving towards an emergency fund as well.
Now, I remember vividly when me and my wife first started using Acorns. So we used that. It was unbelievable how much we had in there in a short amount of time. Obviously, that means we shop too much or we round up too much. I don't know. But it was like, it was mind-blowing. So I do think that's an easy way. I love the idea of automated savings, getting stuff, where it's out of sight, out of mind, where you can put money in there. We even started doing a thing a long time ago where let's just take $2 a day. You'll have $60 in there at the end of the month, 64 depending on the month, 62. So I think there's opportunities to just automate your savings and kind of get them going that way. So
100%. And I'm glad you said automation, because that is probably the number one thing that I advocate for in any good financial plan. If you can build it into your budget that you're saving towards that emergency fund, just literally put it on autopilot so you don't have to sit there and be like, this week's groceries were a little more than I was expecting. Maybe I'll just do $70 instead of the $100. Nope, the $100 is already gone. Yep. You're going to figure out a way to make up that $30 difference. So just to have that built in and automated so you don't have to be part of the decision making each month is by far, I think, the most effective way to build any savings goal, really, but especially an emergency fund.
So another area that we really want families to start thinking about is health insurance. So that's a topic that we can spend probably a whole podcast on, right? Talking about health insurance.
Yeah, truly.
The complexities of the American health insurance complex are more than some people want to think about sometimes. But it's also an important aspect of making sure that you have your finances where they need to be, is choosing the right health plan for you and your family. So I have been someone who struggled with health concerns. So I've had to be real mindful of which plan that I chose for myself and my family. So let's talk a little bit about some considerations to look at when choosing a health plan too.
Yeah, I'd say there are, we'll probably cover two of them primarily because they're the most common in today's episode. We have the high deductible health plan with an HSA, and then we have the PPO plan. Mm-hmm. So PPO plans typically are more expensive in their premiums each month than what you're paying for them, or your employer is paying for them, but their coverage is more generous. You're doing co-pays rather than, potentially fronting a $240 bill to go see your primary care doctor for an illness, not like a preventative thing.
Yeah.
So you want to look at your family's finances. First of all, can you afford the PPO plan? Hopefully the answer is yes, because the reverse of that is if you can't and you choose to do the high deductible plan, then you might get slammed with a high deductible bill. Yes. And that can be pretty rough as well. So some things to keep in mind with that high deductible health plan is having the HSA as a tax advantage vehicle, both on the front and the back end, can be really powerful. You also might get an employer that contributes towards that HSA, which can make it even more appealing. But if we're talking about inviting new little family members, these little gremlins will bump their heads on things and break arms and all sorts of, little kid things happen in those first years of life. So I would say overall, I would recommend that unless you have a lot of savings and you are very comfortable with potentially meeting, the out-of-pocket max on a high deductible plan, I would recommend that probably most families with littles for the first 3 or 4 years of their life would benefit from using a PPO plan. Because, and especially in that first year where we're talking about the cost of birth and things like that. Nice. That's a very easy one to reach an out-of-pocket max on if you have a high deductible health plan. And that can feel like financially catastrophic for some people.
This is one of the reasons why it's vitally important that you spend as much time possible looking at your benefits when you start a new job or when you go through open enrollment, because the way things are nowadays, employers have to switch health plans more regularly. So I know at Third Decade, we started out on one when I first was there. We moved to another one because of the additional cost. So as an employee and as someone who's going to be purchasing this health insurance, you have to be mindful of the new changes that are going to come from a new plan, if that is indeed something that's going to be happening for you. So
yeah, most definitely.
So, okay, so now we talked about having a plan and a strategic plan for your life and setting goals, right? We talked about a budget. We talked about what that looks like. We talked about making sure you have an emergency fund to be able to cover things that pop up throughout your life. So now once you kind of have all that set, you can start thinking about some more long-term aspects. And one thing we want to talk about is a little bit about is how we start thinking about planning for our future when it comes to our families, our children, their education, things of that nature. Let's talk about some of those aspects as well.
Yeah, two of the main types of long-term planning vehicles that we're going to talk about are 529 plans, which you've probably heard about. Anytime someone says they're saving for their children's education, they're most of the time talking about a 529 plan. We'll also talk about an UTMA account, and I'll go into that next. But 529 plans are pretty great because not only do you have a lot of options, every state has their own, and something that I think a lot of people don't know is that you can actually, like, we live in Arizona, we could buy a plan in Utah if that plan seems most favorable to us. So you kind of have a lot of flexibility in what is out there, and you can select the plan that seems to work best for you. So this is going to be a plan with an investment component to it that can be used for education in a lot of different forms. That can look like community college. It can look like private college. It can look like trade school, beauty school, lots of different things. But it does need to be education in some form or another. They do grow tax-free, and they're withdrawn tax-free if you use them on qualifying expenses. It can include room and board, I will say that. But another great thing is that a lot of states offer a state tax deduction for contributing to those accounts. So you want to know what your state offers, as well as, the plan you choose, if it's compatible with your state's offering. So lots of research on that end. Something great about the 529 plans, I think a lot of people are concerned, well, I'm going to contribute to this thing for 18 years and then my kid's not going to go to college. What do I do? They're transferable. So if that child chooses not to go to college and you have another child, you can transfer it over to them. If you decide in your 40s or 50s you'd like to go back to school, you can transfer it over to you. You can give it to a niece or nephew. The name on the account can change very easily. So that is a nice flexibility afforded to the 529 plans. I will say the saving towards a 529 plan can count minimally against what you get whenever you fill out your FAFSA. I learned recently that it's about a little less than 6% of the account's balance can be counted against the financial aid offered to the student. But something really good to know is that if you do get a scholarship, and that's the reason why you don't need the funds, you can actually withdraw that amount that the scholarship was from the account without being penalized. You will have to pay taxes on it, but you'll at least not receive a 10% penalty.
Another thought that I had about 529 plans is that, we talked about the hedonic treadmill and your wants versus needs. When your kids it's Christmas time and all the aunts and the uncles want to buy them gifts, you can have them contribute to the 529 plan as well. So that's an option when it comes to helping and figuring out how to fund a long-term savings plan for your kids.
Yeah, definitely. The other investment vehicle that I had mentioned was the UTMA. That stands for Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. Basically, this is an account that you could use to save and invest towards your children's future in any form. So perhaps you don't really care whether they go to college or not, and you want to give them a really nice little chunk of money when they enter their adulthood. Maybe you want them to be able to pay for their wedding and you don't have to pay for it whenever you're nearing retirement. So that would be an account you could use for that. It can be used on literally anything. They call it the age of majority. That is whenever this custodial account basically is turned over to that child. It is either 18 or 21, depending on the state that you're in. And you can view this as a downside or not, but the contributions to it can't be reversed. So if you've got a kid who grows up and is real ornery, you might not feel great about them getting that money. That is something to be aware of. It also cannot be transferred to a different beneficiary. So, if something happens to the child, God forbid, the money would go through the typical estate process and go back to the parent, most likely, but it can't be given to a different child in place of the original beneficiary. This account also will count more against the financial aid offered to somebody if they do choose to use it on college expenses. That's more around the 20% mark as opposed to that less than 6% mark on the 529 plan. And the taxes are incurred every year on the earnings. So it's still a fairly small amount because it's going to be based on the child's tax rate. The only time it would be based on the parent's tax rate is if those annual earnings exceed $2,500.
So basically, make a note. Make sure I plan on liking my kid before I get my account.
So, when determining how to calculate basically how much to save to meet these funding goals, you want to look at, what percent of their schooling do you want to fund? Do you want to do 100%? A lot of parents are like, you know what? No, I want my kid to actually have some skin in the game. I want to do 50%, and they're going to need to cover the other 50%, be it through scholarships or, financial aid or working a part-time job, whatever it is. So it's one thing to keep in mind. What expenses do you want to cover in their adulthood if you aren't saving towards their education, but just generally speaking, do you want to cover a wedding? And basically there are some really easy online calculators. If you're a financial professional, there's actual physical financial calculators where you would do like a payment function and determine how much you need to save annually or monthly to meet a savings goal based on the investment performance. But anybody listening to this episode, you can probably just head over to Google and say, how much do I need to save if I want to have this amount in this many years? And they can help you establish what your monthly savings goals towards that should be.
We went through a lot today when it comes to thinking about considerations for either you're starting a family, having a family, or wherever you are on your journey when it comes to your finances and dealing with your family. So we hope you have a lot to take away. Watch us a couple times, send it to your friends and family, because we know there's a lot of tidbits here that you want to think about when it comes to budgeting, when it comes to strategic goals, and when it comes to how you want to manage your family particularly. So as we close, anything you want to add?
I like conclose. I think that's how we should start closing out our podcast.
We're doing new words here at Third Decade.
Nothing I think that really comes to mind. Once again, I plan to really pack some good resources into our episode description. So if you are in this season of life where you're ready to move forward with a good financial plan, or you're thinking about planning for a family in the future, there's going to be some really good stuff in our episode description you can find there. As usual, if you are an alumni of our program and you've already been through our program, please continue to tell your friends and family about us. We continue to have a very large majority of our participants come through word of mouth.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a really valuable way to hear about our program, to, hear somebody who's like, no, it's actually, I know it sounds too good to be true. It's not. It's pretty awesome. And then to be able to trust your friend and go through it. And of course, if you're hearing about us for the first time and you are new to us, please check out our website, thirddecade.org. Put in an application for our program. It's free. The only thing you're giving up is your time, but I guarantee your future self will thank you for it. So thank you again, Joe'Mar, for joining me today, and for you all, sharing your time with us and listening in.
All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you for joining us on the Third Decade Podcast. Remember, building your financial future isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about empowering yourself to live the life you want. If today's episode gave you new insights or inspired you to take action, we'd love for you to share it with someone who could benefit. Together, we can turn financial uncertainty into opportunity. Until next time, let's continue to embrace the journey ahead and take control of your financial future.